Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's book to show comparison for the Expanse Season 2, Episode 3, Static. This video is part of a series of videos where I compare episodes of the Expanse TV show to that of its source material, pointing out the differences and giving my opinion on how well I think the adaptation works. I'm not an expert on the novels, just some guy who's read them recently and thought it would be fun to examine the differences. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for The Expanse up to the end of Season 2. However, I will not spoil anything in the novels that have yet to occur in the show, but will spoil events in the novels that have already occurred in the show. So our episode begins with a cool shot of UN missiles destroying Mars' moon Deimos. A mostly unmanned outpost, however, 17 people were killed in the attack. We cut to Bobby Draper and her team dealing with the fallout. Hilly gives Travis shit for being from Earth, which he doesn't take too kindly to, and a fight nearly breaks out between them, but Draper breaks it up real fast, saying they need to train because war is coming. Now, as I already covered in previous videos, in the novels, Earth had actually destroyed Deimos before Mars destroyed Phoebe, not in response to the destruction of Phoebe as it is in the show. But the result was pretty similar, where it brings the two superpowers that much closer to war. And the perspective of Draper's team during this time wasn't something we saw in the books because she wasn't introduced until later in the story. But I think seeing firsthand how this affected Martians and their reaction of wanting to go to war enhances the story, so I'll give this a +1. Next, we cut over to Earth to see Avasarala and Ehrenreich arguing over the possibility of going to war. Ehrenreich seems all charged and ready to go, feeling very confident that Earth could easily win any such battle. But Avasarala isn't so sure, arguing that Mars is a military culture and will fight to the last before giving up, and that they could possibly do significant damage to Earth in the process. So, in the novels, these events happened in Book 1, and Avasarala and Ehrenreich didn't appear until Book 2, so we never got their or any Earthers' perspective on these events. When we first meet them, they're dealing with the fallout of Ganymede incident, so we never really get a conversation between these two about Earth going to war with Mars. And Ehrenreich isn't so gung-ho to start a war in the novels. However, given how his character was developed in the show, this makes sense for what they did with his character, who is very arrogant. And again, I think these scenes add a lot of texture to these incidents that wasn't in the novels, because in the novels these events were just relayed through Holden or Miller watching the news. So it's great to get an insider's look, so I'll give this a +2. So then we go over to the Rosnate at Tycho Station, where the crew look over the damage to the ship caused by the battle, and Alex said it's going to need some serious repairs, but Holden is still very pissed off at what Miller did by killing Dresden in cold blood. On Tycho, Johnson is dealing with the prisoners taken on the Perdigan station, and Miller is there too, also in chains. Diago and some others mistreat the prisoners, to which Johnson steps in and orders the prisoners not to be harmed. Holden then comes charging in and yells at Johnson not to let Miller anywhere near the other prisoners, but Johnson assures him that he won't. Holden then charges at Miller violently, to where Johnson and Naomi have to hold him back, but Miller seems unfazed. Johnson then tells Miller he needs to leave Tycho Station as soon as possible. So in the novels, the Rocinante does return to Tycho after the battle for repairs. However, Miller isn't handcuffed or with the prisoners, and instead is treated quite amicably. But like in the show, Johnson tells him that he needs to leave Tycho. Holden never explodes at him like this, and more of just gives him the cold shoulder. However, since this is a visual medium, I do see the need to see a scene like this with him exploding, so I'll give this a +1. So next we go back to a bar where Miller is drinking alone. He spots Amos in the bar, so offers to join him. Amos seems very weary, so Miller offers him some free booze. So Amos sits down and begins to drink a lot of Miller's booze, shot after shot, to the point where Miller has to push the bottle away from him. Miller asks Amos if he's dipped in shit right now, but Amos says that he's not, that this actually more permanent. He doesn't seem at all interested in talking to Miller and tells him that what the captain says goes, and at the moment the captain doesn't want to have anything to do with him. Miller then challenges Amos because he surely killed people in cold blood as well, and Amos agrees that he's no better than Miller, but that Holden is, which is why he listens to him, because he's sure that Holden knows what he's doing, and then leaves Miller alone, making clear he's not welcome anymore. So a scene similar to this did occur in the novels, where Amos and Naomi and a friend were sitting at a bar where Miller comes up and joins them, but they were being much more friendly to Miller and mostly chit-chatting about the war and current state of politics. But eventually Naomi and her friend leave, leaving Amos and Miller alone, where Amos was straight with him that he wasn't welcomed on the Rocinante anymore. Amos was also a lot more friendly and wasn't just interested in drinking all of his liquor like he was in the show. And the funny thing is that in the novels, Amos specifically tells Miller that he's dipped in shit right now, whereas in the show he specifically says that he isn't, and that's actually worse. It's almost as if the show was stating outright that things are worse than they were in the novels. Either way, I like the book's version of events better, as it seems to make more sense, and the show's version seems unnecessarily melodramatic and makes Amos look a bit like an asshole, so I'll give this a -1. So next we go to Holden and Naomi in a hotel room on Tycho, where Naomi comes up and starts getting intimate with him, but then the subject of Miller comes up, which ruins the mood rather quickly. Holden insists that Miller was in the wrong for killing a man in cold blood, but Naomi shouts back at him that the man was a mass murderer, killing Belters because he didn't treat them as real people, so Miller was right to kill him. So, first off, in the novels, Naomi and Holden weren't intimate at this point, as Holden thought he was rejected by Naomi, but at some point during the sequence, while they're at a bar together, she comes on to him, and that's when they get intimate. Secondly, in the novels, Naomi doesn't confront Holden like this in a screaming match, and instead has a gentle conversation with him about this late at night when they're both lying in bed. In fact, if memory serves, this conversation takes place after they leave Tycho Station, and it's a lot less heated in the novels. And again, I think I prefer the novels version of this scene, so I'll give this a -1. So next we go back to the bar, where Miller is joined by Diago and Stas, who insist that he's a hero for killing Dresden, but Miller doesn't like being called that. He then gets kicked out of the bar, and Diago and Stas realize that Miller doesn't have a place to stay or any money, so they insist that he stay with them. Now, in the novels, a scene like this doesn't exist per se, but Miller does end up staying with Diago, which he insists upon after learning that Miller has no money, so I think this was a great way to set up for that, so I'll give this a +1. Next, we see Alex and Naomi meeting with Drummer in the command center as they look over the damage the Rocinante incurred during the battle, and Drummer comes up with repair teams. She then offers her condolences to Alex for what happened to Demos, and then challenges Naomi to a Belter sport, and she agrees. Now, I think this is a good time to get into Drummer and who she's filling in for in this scene. As I explained in an earlier episode, Drummer doesn't appear in the novels until book 5, and thus this early is taking the place of several other book characters. In this scene, she's specifically filling in for Sam, an engineer on Tycho Station, who actually becomes an important figure in book 3, but seeing that she was excluded from the show here, I suspect that the show will be doing away with her character entirely. In the novel, Sam was responsible for the repairs on the Rocinante and did a damn good job. She was also friendly with Naomi, and they went and hung out together and played games. I can understand the show consolidating characters, although it doesn't make as much sense to have someone who's in command position in charge of repairs of the Rocinante, but that's just a slight thing. I think the actress does a really good job in this role, and it's good to keep the character count down in an adaptation like this, so I'll give this a +1. So next we meet Pablo Cotesar, the scientist captured from the Perdigan station. Fred Johnson explains that he was the only scientist recovered from the station, as the rest were mercenaries or techs. They watch how Cotesar makes diagrams out of food, and when he's interrupted by another cellmate, he beats that cellmate down. They then question him about his work on Eros, but whenever they confront him about his morality, he seems very confused and is only concerned with continuing the work. When Holden tries to tell him he's free of Dresden now, Cotesar explains that if Dresden was there, he'd thank him. They later learn through a medical examination that Cotesar was surgically altered so that parts of his brain responsible for empathy were damaged or removed, thus turning him into a sociopath, which explains his apparent lack of concern about the loss of life on Eros. Now, as I mentioned before, Cotesar was never in the novels at this stage, so we didn't have this direct interaction with him and Johnson. Cotesar was apparently introduced in the noveletta that was released between the third and fourth books called The Vital Abyss, in which he was the main character, and then was introduced into the main book series in the epilogue for Book 5. Now, I haven't read The Vital Abyss, so I couldn't give a clear analysis on how his story here differs from that. Only that his introduction to the storyline here is original material for the show. Also, the information that Perdigan was turning its scientists into sociopaths was actually explained in the scene where they encountered Dresden on Thral Station in the novels, where he mentioned this to them while Johnson and Holden were questioning them. So in the novels, they were already aware of this at this point, but they didn't use the scientists to gather information like they do here in the show. Overall, I'm not quite sure how I feel about these changes, so I'll give this a 0. So next we go to Miller shaving in Diago's room, where Diago's dancing to some techno music, which he says is from Eros, which makes no sense to Miller, so Diago explains that there's sounds almost music-like coming from Eros, which DJs on Tycho Station make music out of. Miller is offended by this and tells Diago to turn it off, stating that the people that he's jamming to are dead, dying, or worse. But Diago explains that that's why it's meaningful. It's a call to arms for the OPA to protect the belt from the inners. Now, this is actually really similar to what happens in the novels, as while Miller is staying with Diago, he introduces him to music made out of the sounds coming from Eros. Miller isn't thrilled about this, but isn't as offended as he is here. But again, either way works fine, so I'll give this a 0. We then get a montage as Naomi and drummer dance at a club. Miller shaves his head. Holden observes Cotesar, and Alex is preoccupied with the guilt of allowing people to die during the battle. He runs battle simulations. So basically showing how our main characters cope with battle in different ways. Miller decides for a change in appearance that's a bit more bare. Holden is obsessed with the protomolecule. Alex is riddled with guilt for letting people die, and Naomi is just carefree and letting herself relax and have a good time. So in the novels, they pretty much were all relaxing at this stage. I don't recall if Miller shaved his head or not in the novels, but how he was feeling at this time was pretty much the same sentiments. Alex and Holden, however, were a lot more relaxed and were partying like Naomi. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, Holden hooks up with Naomi at a club at this time. But I do really like the contrast of how the different characters handle pressure in different ways, and so I'll give this a +2. So then we go over to the Martian ship, where Travis makes a replica of Earth to use as target practice, meant to show his hatred of Earth, but the others make fun of him and claim that it's a loving recreation. A fight then breaks out between them, which Draper ends by punching Travis. Draper is then brought in front of Lieutenant Sutton, who dresses her down for assaulting one of her team and tells her, despite being born on Earth, Travis is just as Martian as any of them. When Draper agrees and calls Travis one of the best people she's served with, Sutton then realizes that it's not about him and more to do with their overall frustration of not being deployed against Earth. But Sutton makes it clear war with Earth isn't on the agenda and instead informs her that they're being deployed on Ganymede, something Draper sees as demeaning, as she calls it, farm patrol, but Sutton insists that she follow orders. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Draper wasn't introduced in the novels until the Ganymede incident, so all of this that occurs beforehand is an invention of the show, but I do think it adds a lot to these characters, and it reminds me of the film Jarhead, where U.S. soldiers deployed in Iraq get frustrated as they just sit there and see no action. So I like the way they translated that type of story here, and will make Draper's story more interesting once her book storyline kicks in, so I'll give this a +2. So then we go to Avasarala, as Cotesar managed to secure a way for Avasarala to contact Fred Johnson, but he advises against it, as doing so would be considered treason and could get her in prison. But she insists on doing it anyway, stating that it could save thousands of lives. So Johnson receives the message from her, where she informs him that everything she's been saying publicly about him is a lie, and that she knows that there's a big conspiracy here, and asks for help to uncover it. So Drummer suspects that it's a trap, but Johnson, who's good at reading people, believes that she's sincere and intends to send her the information that she wants. Drummer warns that if the OPA finds out that he's working with her, they'd kill him, so Johnson insists that it must stay secret between them. So needless to say, nothing like this happens in the novel, since Avasarala isn't in the story at this point. However, at the end of Book 1, after Eru's incident, there's a peace summit that Johnson is at, and he speaks with representatives of Earth and Mars, so talking to him isn't really considered treason, at least not at the stage Avasarala is introduced into the story in the novels. But I really like the similarities between the two characters here, as they both risk a death or imprisonment from the organizations they work for just by speaking to each other, but they do so anyway because they both believe they're trying to accomplish the same things, and they realize that their goals are more important and worth the risk. It also speaks highly of both of their characters, that they're both smart enough to know that the other one is sincere, so I'll give this a +4. We then get a scene of Amos visiting Cotesar, where he tells him about how he found Julie Mal's protocule-infested body, and Cotesar is absolutely fascinated by this and calls it beautiful. When Amos insists Julie was dead, Cotesar isn't so sure that she was dead, rather that the protomolecule was learning and mutating. Amos then leaves prematurely, which upsets Cotesar, who wants to know more about the protomolecule. Amos then goes to Holden and explains to him that Cotesar is like a pedophile, but that the protomolecule is his pedophilia, so by threatening to take the protomolecule away, he gets closed off and unwilling to cooperate. But Amos learned by giving him more information about the protomolecule, it feeds his obsession, and thus he's more willing to cooperate. So Holden and Amos visit him again, and this time plays along with his obsession in order to gather more information. Holden asks if he can control it, and Cotesar insists on having his data, and says that he can't tell them much without it. So they provide him with his data, and he insists that the voices are a countdown, that the protomolecule is building something. When they ask what, he simply says, "We're going to find out." So as I mentioned, Cotesar wasn't in the novels at this stage, so this is all an invention of the show. There was no mention of a countdown or the protomolecule building something, so I find this all effective build-up to what's to come that was kind of lacking in the novels. In addition, I like the interactions between Amos and Cotesar, that Amos understood his mindset, having lived with lowlifes his whole life. So I thought these scenes added a lot, so I'll give this a +3. So then we get a scene of Miller going to the Mormons asking for information about their ship, the Nauvoo. He does it under the guise of wanting to convert and join them, and the Mormons, always eager for new converts, are very forthcoming with information about their ship. At the end, Miller says that it's just what he needs. No doubt this was meant to fool the viewer into believing Miller really wanted to go with the Mormons because he has nowhere else to go, but as we soon learn, he has other plans. Now, to my recollection, no specific scene like this exists in the book. It just shows Miller studying the Nauvoo and learning more. But I must say this was a successful fake out. It fooled me, so I'll give this a +2. Back on Earth, we see that Fred Johnson has responded to Avasarala's message by sending her information on the stealth ship, the one that they destroyed at the Protogen station, and where to find it, to which Avasarala is shocked. So, as I mentioned, this storyline didn't take place in the novels, and as far as I remember, they never mentioned what happened to the stealth ship they destroyed at Throth Station. So I like in the show that they tied up these loose ends and tied it to the main storyline, so I'll give this a +2. So back on the Rocinante, we see Alex continuing his battle simulations, which he's obsessed with. When Holden asks what he's doing, he simply says, "You can see what I'm doing." Holden tries to console Alex by saying that he saved Amos's life, but Alex retorts that in doing so, he allowed 25 people to die, and he makes it clear that he's going to keep practicing so this doesn't happen again. So nothing like this occurs in the novels, as at this point in the novels, Alex is out partying or helping with the repairs to the Rocinante. So I actually find this a really interesting character arc that really fleshes out his character much more than it was in the novels, so I'll give this a +3. So next we get a little scene back on the Martian ship where Travis looks for the right tool and Draper hands it to him as a gesture of goodwill. He at first hesitates but then accepts it, and then Hilly pats him on the back, meaning that they're all one healthy, happy team again and that look out for each other. So again, nothing like this in the novels, but I think it adds so much to see the group dynamic within Draper's unit, as although they may squabble, in the end they look after each other like family, and I think this makes the impact of what happens to them on Ganymede so much stronger than it was in the novel, so I'll give this a +2. So back on Tycho, Miller approaches Fred Johnson, and when he sees him, Johnson asks if he figured out where he wants to go yet, and he replies Eros, which of course confuses Johnson. But Miller elaborates that Eros is a problem and something that needs to be dealt with. When Johnson asks how they would dispose of Eros, Miller points to the Nauvoo and says, "with that." So the other shoe drops. Miller doesn't want to go on the Nauvoo, he wants to use it to destroy Eros. So this is pretty much the same way it went down in the novels, perhaps a bit less dramatic and cliffhangery, but basically Miller went to Johnson with the plan to use the Nauvoo to knock Eros into the sun, and Johnson agreed. So either way is fine, so I'll give this a 0. So my final adaptation score for Static is a +22. Surprisingly high, as I don't think this episode is that great, and it's mostly just a setup episode that transitions from the attack on Protogen Station to the coming storyline with Eros, but it's pretty good setup. As far as setups go, this works really well, and it adds a lot of dynamic that wasn't quite there in the novels, so yes, this was a good adaptation. So that's it for my book-to-show comparison for The Expanse Season 2, Episode 3. I'll be back in about a month for my book-to-show comparisons for Season 2, Episode 4. But in the meantime, you can check out my channel for more videos, including extensive coverage of The Expanse Season 3, which starts this week, and I'm really excited about. So we'll be doing weekly reviews and weekly live streams for each episode. I also do videos on other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, Babylon 5, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.